Thank you, and welcome to the second hearing for the Committee's inquiry into the development of the Transport-Oriented Development Program. I acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians on the lands of which we are meeting today. I pay my respects to elders past and present and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of New South Wales. I also acknowledge and pay my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. My name's Sue Higginson and I'm the chair of the committee. I ask everyone in the room to please turn their mobile phones to silent. Parliamentary privilege applies to witnesses in relation to the evidence they give today. However, it does not apply to what witnesses say outside of the hearing. So I urge witnesses to be careful about making comments to the media or to others after completing their evidence. In addition, the Legislative Council has adopted rules to provide procedural fairness for inquiry participants. I encourage committee members and witnesses to be mindful of these procedures. Welcome and thank you for making the time to give evidence today. Could I please start with each witness, starting from my left. Please state your name, position, title, and swear either an oath or an affirmation.
My name is Councillor Zoe Baker. I am the Mayor of North Sydney, and I solemnly and sincerely declare and affirm that I will well and truly interpret the evidence that will be given and do all other matters and things that are required of me in this hearing to the best of my ability.
Thank you.
And I'm Scott Duncan. I'm the Section Manager for Local Planning and Policy in the Strategic Planning Unit at the Central Coast Council. And I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Thank you.
I'm Sarah Hartley. I'm a Senior Strategic Planner at Central Coast Council. I swear by Almighty God that I will well and truly interpret the evidence that will be given and do all other matters and things that are required of me in this hearing to the best of my ability.
Thank you. And would each of you like to start by making an opening statement?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair and honourable members. I too acknowledge that we meet here today on Gadigal land and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And thank you for your invitation to give evidence today. I thought it would be useful to begin by providing you with some context and history in relation to the planning in the St Leonard's Crow's Nest precinct. As you know, North Sydney Council is a Tier 1, one of the 8 TOD precincts at Crow's Nest Metro Station. The North Sydney local government area is 10.49 square kilometres and it's one of the 3 most densely populated local government areas in New South Wales. 89% of dwellings in our local government area are medium or high density. Minister Scully cites often Waverton and Wollstonecraft as examples of density done well, and that is no accident. North Sydney is, I would say, the poster child for up, not out. We are an inner urban council, we're not the leafy Upper North Shore. We have the lowest levels of open space and recreational facilities in the whole of northern Sydney, and even less than that in the City of Sydney. North Sydney Council and our community recognise the urgency of the housing crisis, the complexity of the causes and the solutions, and we are committed to prioritising affordable housing and planning for growth. Our experience is the more dwellings that are built in North Sydney, the higher the prices are. They are at historic highs now and they are climbing. Private supply alone is not going to make any material difference to affordability in urban areas such as ours. Under Council's existing plans, the residential population of North Sydney is expected to increase by 19,500 people or a 27% increase above the existing population by 2036. Jobs targets for our area are to provide capacity for up to 37,400 jobs by 2036, which recognises our place in the Eastern Economic Corridor. The TOD program is unfortunately totally silent on employment targets. Following the announcement of the Metro project in July 2016, the state government announced a planned precinct for Crows Nest St Leonards, and ultimately the St Leonards Crows Nest 2036 plan was made in August 2020 after really rigorous community consultation. And that plan states that it will facilitate the urban renewal of St Leonards and Crows Nest for an expanding employment centre and a growing residential community. The 2036 plan requires the precinct to absorb significant additional residential and commercial density with 6,683 new dwellings, and provides for the provision of regional open space and facilities through a special infrastructure contribution, or the SIC. The SIC had, when the plan was made, a list of infrastructure, open space, school places and road improvements to be delivered to serve the planned new population, and those works totalled $116.581 million. Unfortunately, the SIC was recently abolished as a result of the Housing and Productivity Contributions Order, and so funding for the vital community infrastructure under the existing 2036 plan remains extremely uncertain. Community scepticism about the state government delivering the infrastructure is high, and I think justified. As of today, 10 rezoned sites in the 2036 plan area in our local government area alone will produce 1,078 new dwellings, and of those, only 2 sites with 174 dwellings between them have an approval and are under construction. So no doubt you have heard other evidence in relation to the lag between rezoning, approvals and construction, and the reality of land banking, and I would say the extreme fragility of the construction sector currently. Meanwhile, Sydney water capacity in the St Leonards Growth Area Precinct is limited. The Sydney Water 2024 to 2029 Growth Servicing Plan recognises that there's limited trunk capacity for wastewater in the St Leonards area, which is right in the middle of the Todd Precinct. It's in this context that the accelerated Todd Precinct was announced. The limited capacity of utilities such as wastewater are reflected in the densities that were adopted under the existing 2036 plan. The Todd program has not adequately addressed delivery of capacity upgrades in the precinct. The Minister also announced $520 million for the 8 Tier 1 accelerated Todd precincts for the provision of infrastructure to accompany additional density, open space, school places, road upgrades, etc. But there is no detail as to how that amount will be divided between the 8 precincts and the differences in the costs of delivery between those precincts. The proposed infrastructure funding will not touch the sides of the need or deliver for the additional density in the accelerated Todd precincts. We and North Sydney already have an infrastructure deficit for those living in the Crows Nest Todd precinct now. That deficit is intensified for the planned 2036 population, and this Todd program will add to that again without any plan or certainty about the delivery of the essential open space, school places, recreational facilities and hospital beds. Adequate, realistic funding and delivery of infrastructure and capacity upgrades to accompany any new development is required now. History and experience with the SIC shows that if it's not provided up front, it may never eventuate. Planning ultimately is not about theoretical dwelling numbers, it's about people and shaping where and how we live. The failure to fund and deliver for open space, school places, hospital beds, road upgrades will have direct and devastating negative impacts on the existing and future residents of these precincts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would either of you from Central Coast like to make an opening statement?
Yes, I've just got a short opening statement.
Thank you very much.
To make on behalf of the Central Coast Council. But yeah, thanks for the opportunity you've given us today to address and talk about the issues associated with the transport-orientated development set. The Central Coast Council, we support the desire for increasing the diversity of housing and the density of housing in well-targeted locations, particularly where these areas have the capacity to support additional housing. And Council has the vision to create a more diverse housing supply where people want to live. I guess that concept, it's articulated in Council's recently adopted local housing strategy, and it aligns with the vision which is established by the Central Coast Regional Plan. However, we consider that the TODCEP changes are unnecessary. They create an unnecessary layer of planning assessment, where we've already conducted quite a lot of detailed planning. There's a lot of detailed master plans, development control plans that already apply to these TOD centres, and there's already a complex planning controls which achieve sort of comparable densities and heights when considering the lot amalgamation bonuses that are given in many of these TOD centres. In Council's submission, we raised concerns about the expedited nature of the consultation and the lack of information presented in the consultation materials and the one-size-fits-all approach that was taken. So I guess there are some points in our submission which have been superseded because more information has come to light, with the advent of the TODCEP maps and the TODCEP instrument. So I just wanted to make sure that you kept that in mind when you read our submission. Mm-hmm. I guess the other point we'd like to make is, whilst we commend the principle of mandatory affordable housing, I guess in terms of our consultation with local community housing providers, it's been suggested that at a 2%, the 2% target and the markets for Woy Woy, Gosford, Tuggerah and Wyong, that this will result in an affordable housing product that's unviable for any community housing provider. And there's also a lack of detail in the TODCEP on how the community housing will be transferred to other providers and how that will be delivered. And I think there's also other models that could better be used to achieve community housing as well, such as the creation of contribution schemes to fund community housing more broadly. I think it's also complicated too in terms of conducting smaller scale residential flat developments. If, say, 1 unit out of every 50 has to be set aside for community housing, it's not that practical for a lot of community housing providers just to manage a single unit in a complex. There's probably more efficient models that could be looked at. So that's one of the points we'd like to make. I guess our submission, it recommended the exclusion of the TODCEP locations. We've currently got 4 TODCEP locations nominated on the Central Coast, that being Wyong, Tuggerah, Gosford and Woy Woy. And I guess the main reason for that really relates to the low opportunity for housing yield, the limited application which the TODCEP provisions would actually apply to within the 400 metre walking zones, and the existing controls that already apply to our centre, which offer sort of comparable heights and density to those that are proposed in the TODCEP. And I guess the fact that a lot of our own DCP and LEP controls in these centres have been developed in a quite over time in consultation with the community and are informed by considerations like view sharing, an analysis of height, overshadowing, and car parking and traffic and infrastructure servicing capacities. So that's particularly the case for Gosford and Wyong and Woy Woy. I don't think I've got any other points, but yeah, we're happy, Sarah and I are happy to take any questions on our submission.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those very helpful opening submissions, and thank you for your submission. It is a very useful submission. We do have a few questions and we'll just free flow through those, and I can see my colleague here is ready to jump.
Chomping at the bit.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Farley.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for all of you for being here today. I might start off with the Central Coast Council, because I've had the benefit of being able to read your submission, and you make many salient points throughout that submission. One of them being in terms of the actual yield you'll get in some of these sites. So in Gosford, and this committee actually has recently visited Gosford for another inquiry, and I'm a regular visitor to Gosford and the Central Coast, but you see the cranes in the sky, you see very large buildings coming up. What is the actual yield that you think, or that you've estimated, will be achieved from the TODCEP increasing what's already available in Gosford at the moment through your master planning process?
Yep. So I guess in terms of the actual zones that the TODCEP applies to,
yep,
it will only apply to a relatively small area within the Gosford area. The Gosford area is already subject to
And that's on the western side of the
western
station?
side, yeah. I think we mapped the area that it would apply to.
Yep.
We may have to take the actual increase. Do you have the figures on the actual increase on that small area on the western side, or we
No, we don't have the numbers.
Would you be able
on
to
it.
take that on notice?
Yeah,
in
we can
terms
take
of
that on notice.
that? Because from my reading of it, Gosford, it is a very small application. Considering what's the highest building you have zoned in Gosford at the moment?
I don't have that available and can provide that
We're
information.
looking substantially more than 6 stories.
Yeah.
Potentially even, I think, what is it, maybe 30 stories or so in Gosford? That would
It
be
is above 30 stories,
Above
and
30
that
stories?
comes about through a different zoning category than
Yeah.
what's available in the TODSEPs. We have their former zoning descriptions that I think superseded potentially 12 months ago.
Yeah.
We've got commercial core.
And you talk as well about the lot amalgamation bonuses that are available to you under that master plan. So you actually do have a proposal at the moment to be able to actually consolidate lots, and you, of course, now we've seen some revisions when it comes to the TODSEP. I think it's a minimum lot width of 21 metres, but there is no proposal really to consolidate lots and to be able to achieve those larger bonuses that might have less impact, so to speak, on some of the other concerns like shadowing or the like.
Yeah, that's correct. And particularly in Woy Woy, the standards are quite comparable there, and there's the the LEP provisions that allow for amalgamation, and then we'll deliver those comparable scale and heights that what the TOD.
So
may I
going back
just
to
ask-
Woy Woy, just
Yeah. Oh, no, it was
Miss-
just why you've mentioned Woy Woy.
If you want.
There was a suggestion in the media that Council's administrator had suggested that Woy Woy Station be included. Is that the case?
That's correct. Our administrator did suggest the inclusion of Woy Woy as an additional TOD site.
And why was that the case?
That was a direct communication with the administrator and the minister. So
And did that
I'm not
come
aware
from
of
did that come from advice that you'd provided at all, or?
Our submission had already been tabled, I understand, prior to that
Okay.
communication.
And just looking at Woy Woy, because as you say, it's largely picked up. And when you draw the 400 metre radius around Woy Woy, about 2/3 of it's in the water. So it just seems a little bizarre to me in terms of a site when there seems to be the relevant controls there already, and drawing a 400 metre radius gets you, water which you can't rezone.
I think the TODSEP provisions, they do apply to some residential land and some other business zone land at Woy Woy. I guess if you look at our site consolidation provisions under clause 4.3 of CCLEP, that would allow a site to be developed up to 19.75 metres using those bonuses if you could get a site area above 1,000
So
square
you get
metres.
slightly more with the TODSEP.
You get slightly more, and you would
Maybe
also
another
get
story.
an FSR bonus of between 2.1 and 2.3, depending upon what site. So you get a slightly more FSR and slightly more height, but not substantially more. Yeah.
So going up to the other side, so Tuggerah, again, this is a small portion of the land that's actually picked up in terms of the TODSEP radius. Again, from my reckoning, when it comes to Tuggerah, you've got Hillview Crescent, Yaldean Close, Tamburlaine Street, Arunta Road, and maybe a couple of properties on the Pacific Highway that are picked up. Is that your assessment as well?
That's correct.
It's a small segment. A lot of them are, have significant biodiversity issues, flooding, and they're not the correct zoning category that is applying in this.
Okay, so
TODSEP.
it sounds like a completely inappropriate place to be able to pick up for high density. Well, that's been Council's assessment in the past, has it? Or
Yeah, well, that was our conclusion, that the Tuggerah site, given the significant flooding constraints that exist around Tuggerah, there are also topographic and ecological constraints. There's only very small areas that would be activated by the TODSEP provision, and some of those residential areas are very fragmented. They're all already in very small lots, so they'd be difficult to consolidate and achieve sort of the TOD objectives. And in saying that too, there's already a very large planning proposal.
the Tuggerah Gateway?
Yeah.
So that's 2,200 properties, is it?
That's the maximum
Okay.
yield
So
proposed.
why did Council identify that site, the Tuggerah Gateway site, rather than identifying that small portion that's picked up by the TODSEP? What was your reasoning behind doing that?
The Tuggerah Gateway site, it's still proximate to the station, and it's a very large site adjoining the Westfield Shopping Centre. So,
Yep. So
we're
you're actually
very
centrally
limited.
located to what essentially is the centre of Tuggerah in many ways, that congregates around the shopping centre rather than around the train station, which has got a homemaker centre on one side effectively, and McDonald's on the other, and very little sort of connectivity and roads that are sort of built up and suspended, and a station which doesn't really have a street precinct leading to it.
That's correct. It was more of a linear activation strategy where it was more feasible to activate land along that, alongside the Westfield Shopping Centre and the Gateway site, because, the Tuggerah site's basically constrained by flooding and other ecological issues and steep slopes, so it's only got limited opportunities to activate it.
And have you had development interest in terms of that Tuggerah Gateway precinct? Have you got developers who are ready to move in there and start building those homes?
Well, we have a rezoning proposal that's under assessment.
Yep. But have you sensed a lot of interest in terms of the development community on the Central Coast for that project?
I haven't been subject to any sort of inquiries from the development industry on that site. But
Okay. And with respect to Tuggerah as well, do you have an estimate in terms of the estimated dwellings that TOD could yield there in those 5 or 6 streets?
we'd have to take that on notice, but in terms of it would probably be a theoretical yield.
Sure, of course.
Very difficult to achieve with ownership that fragmented.
Okay, thank you if you could take that on notice.
Yep.
And now moving to Wyong. So Wyong, I guess you've got a town centre there. It does make a bit more sense than some of the other sites. But you've outlined in your submission that you've had similar controls in place in Wyong, but you haven't had any interest in those densities so far. Do you want to just outline maybe what some of those challenges have been and why no one's taken those up so far in Wyong?
Yep. My impression would be it probably relates to the cost of development and the feasibility of development. Obviously there's different feasibilities that apply in different property markets, across the Greater Sydney area on these different TOD sites. You've got the suburban TOD sites and the Sydney-based TOD sites. So I guess it comes down to, can an apartment building be developed and constructed, and can they still sell the product? And would people still pay for that? So I guess there are other competing demands in the northern part of the Central Coast. You would be competing with house and land packages. So it comes to the question, would somebody rather live and buy a house and land package at Warnervale or Dowball? Would they rather live in an apartment for sort of a comparable price in Wyong? So that would be my... would come down
Estimation
to
as
the
to why it's
economics
not
of
been picked up
development
so far.
and demand.
Okay, so those controls are for, from memory, 25 metre height, 3 to 1 FSR, so greater than what the final TOD proposal ended up being.
In some sites within the Wyong, in some places they're lower, but in saying that, our planning controls, or LEP and DCP controls, they're based on sort of a detailed assessment of Wyong. So, they're not like a blanket control. There are different heights and FSRs on different sites.
Yep. And in Wyong, you've also got some heritage considerations as well, and heritage listed properties and heritage conservation areas. In terms of your reading of the final TOD SEP and then the associated guidance to transport-oriented development, do you have a clear, as sort of the planning section of Central Coast Council, do you have sort of a clear understanding of how the TOD will interact with heritage, or do you need more guidance on that, with that respect?
No, my understanding is heritage sites have been included from the TOD SEP mapping.
Yep. But in terms of how you assess heritage, in line with your DCP and the, I think it's 5.10 controls and that, are you clear in terms of that assessment process? And
That
its
it's
application?
that it would be a merit assessment within the existing planning framework. Yep.
And do you see much change then to the current arrangements when it comes to heritage at all, and how you would assess things?
Well, obviously, as Mr. Duncan has spoken to, the controls that exist in Wyong have been strategically developed and allowed for those heritage items that exist in there. There are varying heights that step away from Wyong train station out to the outer skirts of the city centre. So height and density obviously decreases away from the railway line. Our heritage items are interspersed throughout the city centre, and so those controls have adapted and been designed to
Respect that heritage.
The heritage value of those sites, but I think within the existing planning framework those assessments can be made. But I think what the difference would be is obviously having a Todd site sitting next to a heritage property. I'd have to take on notice the height to compare it to under the current controls might be significantly less, maybe 3 stories, 4 stories,
So
sitting next to a
impact on it,
heritage
yeah.
property than your 6 stories sitting next to. So there's obviously those differences in the Todd.
Okay. And one final question from me then. The affordable housing provision that you raised, and I had the fortune of meeting with Pacific Link a couple of weeks ago as well, who raised similar issues with me. And I think they've got their opening of their Canton Beach development today as well, so good luck to them with that. And they're a great outfit, and that is a similar concern they raised with me in terms of the actual viability for them in managing. And you've now seen the guidance where it's sites over 2,000 square metres must provide the 2% affordable housing on site. Is that something you think would work, or would you prefer to see that in another arrangement, potentially a financial contribution to enable council to provide, or a community housing provider to provide affordable housing, maybe in a better managed system, like on one site, or in partnership with a developer on one site where it might be 15% rather than 2%?
Yeah, I think there's the option to consider other alternatives. It would be good to have that option, especially for a lot of the smaller scale residential apartments that might be approved through the TODSEP provisions. I think it would be, you could create a more streamlined system and better manage affordable housing provision through some sort of affordable housing contribution scheme.
Thank you very much. We'll hand over.
Can I just,
Yeah, of
Regis
course.
2, Chair? I just wrote this down. Will Central Coast Council deliver on the housing targets the government sets for the next 5 years?
I certainly hope so, but I'm not in a position to answer that question. In terms of the approvals, the approval targets, they seem quite realistic. But council often doesn't have any control over what's actually built at the end of the day. We don't have control over that process that's sort of linked to construction, interest rates, and the broader economy.
Okay, I'll change it slightly then. Is council committed to delivering on those targets?
Council has those commitments through our local housing strategy that we've recently adopted, and what Mr Duncan was articulating is the areas that we have control over in terms of assessment and certification. We are already delivering. I don't have the specific numbers, I can take that on notice, but we are already delivering within that those targets in terms of development approvals. So the areas that we do have control over, we're demonstrating already that we can achieve those targets. The area of completion, funding, those areas that we don't have control over, we can't speak to.
Okay, thank you. And that's quite reasonable, so thank you. If you could take that on notice, that would be wonderful. Sure. And could I ask Mayor Baker the same thing in relation to North Sydney Council, please?
Yes, we're committed to achieving our targets, and like Central Coast, we adopted a local housing strategy in 2019 and a local strategic planning statement in 2020. Under both of those figures that I quoted to you about the 19,500, we're well on the way to delivering, and part of that was not only in the planned precinct, or had various names before it became the 2036 plan, but it was an urban activation precinct. That was an important part of it. Like other councils, I sort of talked about it a little bit in our opening statement. We have not only planned via our zoning capacity, but there's this big gap between planning proposals and rezonings, and then the time period in which development applications are submitted to council, and then even once they're approved, an even longer gap between whether they're then activated. And so even with the best will in the world and a commitment to the delivery of housing, the council's role is we can't force people to put in D8s and we can't force them to build them.
Can I ask both of you then, and this is a sort of in relation to another inquiry, and that is, how big an issue are zombie DAs in your areas?
I think Gosford, the cranes that are in the sky speak to that.
Yeah.
Some of those approvals were around 15 years ago prior to CCLEP 2022. Some of those provisions were when GLEP 2014 came into place, and it's now 2024 and we've got cranes in the sky. So I think that speaks to the delivery.
Okay.
In North Sydney, I don't know that we could call it zombie. I think it's more land banking, because the profitability and the cost of land in our area. But there is definitely a land banking issue. So, for example, there's a property at 617 to 621 Pacific Highway, very close to St Leonard's Station, and on the way and in between the metro and the St Leonard's Station. That was rezoned for effectively a capacity of 195 dwellings in 2019. The DA wasn't lodged until October of last year. And so that's a 4 or 5 year lag between the capacity having been increased and then the application being submitted. And once that's approved, it could be 5 years, but they could do a physical commencement and it could be a very long time. And so I think that's a reflection of some real structural issues about the cost of finance and the fragility of the construction sector itself that is well beyond local government to address.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask if I could, with Central Coast, where you referred to some of the areas, the flooding and the biodiversity areas, does it now? Do you anticipate that those areas may be adjusted or changed, given the announcement of the government that, development in floods is not a good idea? And have you had communication around that, or what's your anticipation around that?
I guess in terms of the Tuggerah site, there's quite a lot of flood-prone land that was never included within the TODSEP application area. So I guess I was just making a comment about, some of the, the topographic and flooding constraints around Tuggerah, which means that it's quite difficult to activate that as a TOD site around the station. Pretty well a lot of those other smaller residential blocks near the Tuggerah station, I think they're mostly flood-free. And then there's also a larger site close, which has sort of got endangered ecological communities over it, which might pose some sort of issues in the future, I guess, in terms of realising development.
And this is to both councils. Do you think, how would you identify and how would you kind of articulate any negative consequences of the TODSEP at this point in time? I know that you spoke around those issues, but what do they look and sound like for a mayor on a council or a councillor's perspective, and then a strategic planning perspective? If Councillor Baker, if you have some views on that.
Because we're one of the 8 accelerated, and it's in a precinct that we've already identified and worked extensively and carefully with the state government to increase residential and employment targets to meet the metro. And I suppose there's 2 things. One is the process is so expedited that we're not going to be able to have the careful analysis that was part of the preparation of the 2036 plan. So the Crow's Nest sites and St Leonard's are surrounded by heritage conservation areas. The heights that are there under the 2036 plan were designed in order to minimise overshadowing on the heritage conservation areas, but also there's only 2 very small pieces of public open space serving that very dense precinct already. And so one of the concerns is the physical impacts of additional yield, because it will come as height. Another is relating to certainty in terms of what those height might be once the TOD for Crow's Nest is made. Because there are bonuses under Clause 16 of the Housing SEP that allow for additional 30% increase in height and FSR. And are we looking at those continuing to apply in those 8 TOD precincts? If that's the case, then we have real impacts in terms of additional population and the obvious sunlight views, privacy, trinity of amenity impacts on what's already a very dense precinct. And then finally, it's that scepticism I talked to you about, which is there is a really important social contract with community when you're doing careful planning about increasing density. And in fact, Crow's Nest St Leonard's is an example of where our community have engaged and have accepted amenity impacts that are devastating to some, but they've done it on the understanding that there would be delivery of a better public domain and some additional open space and the social and community infrastructure to meet the new population. And if you're not got a pathway to ensure that will be delivered, and not delivered in 10 or 15 years, but to meet the time that the buildings are being built, it's that uncertainty. And if that doesn't happen, then you're dealing with a new population who don't have enough school places. That was identified in the 2036 plan. Overcrowded schools. And the one thing about high density living that we know is open space is even more important than anywhere else, because families, and that's what the majority of people in North Sydney are, raising their families or living in flats. The public domain and public open space is vital, because it becomes an extension of where you live.
Thank you. And Central Coast, in terms of those kind of, tangible negative consequences, or, how do you view that?
I think fundamentally, as we've put in our submission, in terms of the controls, they're on comparison with what we already have in place across our planning framework. I think the significant difference is that we're introducing land uses into zones that we've not intended to be there. And under the planning framework, there are objectives for each zone to clearly understand what the vision for that zone is. And so when you introduce land uses across a state policy that undermine those definitions and undermine those land uses, you are challenging the nature of what those zones are to be. And so while the TODSEP has come out with controls that still uphold our flooding and our biodiversity considerations and our amenity considerations, while that will be complicated because they'll be interspersed with other buildings, I think the fundamental issue is that it's undermining what planning is when you distinguish land according to its zone. For example, there is an intention with an R2 zone and what the objectives are on that zone. And so when you take that to a court case, you can argue the very fine-grained detail of the planning controls on the merits of things like overshadowing, biodiversity, those sorts of things. But when you come back to the fundamentals of what an R2 zone is, often court cases are won and lost because you're not meeting the objectives of the zone. With the state policy coming in and overriding those, you end up in a court case where you have a state policy dictating what a land use can be, but that's in direct conflict with what the objective of the zone is. And so that's a very difficult position to argue as a town planner in a court case.
So on that, do you anticipate, with where you sit and what you've seen over time, do you anticipate that there will likely be brought on these kind of challenges, and council will be facing these in terms of as in the court cases and the pushback and the relationship with proponents. Do you anticipate that may eventuate from this planning control?
I think our expectation is that the TOD, there will be limited yield that will come from the TOD, but I think there's always the opportunity where applicants are testing these new provisions. They are new provisions, and often the new provisions are tested in the court. You have definitions that are tested in the court. We get good case law that then upholds what the intentions are. But I think where you have a conflict between a policy that clearly identifies height, parking, scale, and those standards have flow-on effects on amenity, on open space, livability, desirability of a building, that is in direct conflict with what the zone then says. And the zoning objective is your high order merit assessment when you come to a planning assessment. That's the first thing that you review. What's the plan? What's the zone? And what are the objectives on the zone? So there is a direct conflict between what these development standards are allowing and the zoning objectives in the areas that they're putting these land uses in. I'm not sure if I've made that clear.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. So in essence, though, if there's the situation that eventuates that you have a opportunistic proponent that is looking at one end of the controls in the TODSEP, and you're trying to implement and enforce a good merit decision relying on your DCP, there would be some challenge in that kind of zone, and that's quite likely to occur. And I'd be curious about North Sydney as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think we're in because we have a 2036 plan, and the TOD will effectively. The way that I see it happening is that the 2036 plan provides for a huge amount of density, that the TOD and the work that the department will be doing and then ultimately adopting will then translate the base of the 2036 plan into a SEP with some additional yield. I think there's a couple of concerns. One is what will it really mean in terms of delivery of affordable housing in the precinct, and what cost in terms of amenity impacts for the additional height in order to deliver that, and then the other concern that we have is because there's no mention about employment targets, that our precinct is part of that Eastern Economic Corridor, and you can't just do it in isolation, this big additional potential yield for housing, without understanding what that's going to mean and how we're going to be able to accommodate the job targets. And it's important at Crow's Nest because that metro was there to serve both housing and employment. And the reason it's there at Crow's Nest is because it's in a hospital precinct, it's in a very dense education precinct. And so I suppose it's those matters of uncertainty that I think need to be addressed up front. And that other layer of how do the existing current bonuses of 30% increase in FSR apply, because what we're seeing now is there are at least 2 state significant development applications that have been amended in order to take that got big uplifts under the 2036 plan in terms of height and FSR, and they're now amending with the 30% additional height. And so that then does have an impact on the ground. It has an impact on traffic congestion on the Pacific Highway and surrounding streets, which is at capacity, and it has an impact in that you've got additional population without the additional open space and social infrastructure to serve it.
And just on that, so that's your, I think that's encapsulated in your statement at the beginning, and I didn't quite capture it, but it was planning is not about theoretical housing numbers, it's about people. In that vein, do you see that, how do you think you will deal with the challenge of making sure there is enough green space, enough wellness space? And we've heard again in another inquiry that in terms of density, one of the most fundamental things in terms of how the planning system interacts with climate change and heat impacts of dense urban areas, it is about deep soil and it's about tree cover and green space. How do you think your council will be dealing with that, particularly in North Sydney?
Well, we're strongly putting to the department and to the minister that has to be part of what it goes on exhibition with as part of this Todd precinct. We're already challenged in North Sydney. We've lost more than 3,000 mature trees over the last 2 years as a result of the Western Harbour Tunnel and Warringah Freeway upgrade works. We already had some decline in canopy because of the impact, mostly from private land and the impacts of development. And it is really important that those measures are part of any consideration under the work that the department is doing with council on the Todd. And so I suppose there's those issues about environmental sustainability, but well-being, and not just, the overused phrase of livability, but it's genuine, is that high density requires some decent open space, and to make these spaces livable. So one of the things that I'm sure that we will be putting to the Department of Planning is that there may need to be a special contribution for this Todd precinct in order to deliver it, over and above the 520 million, and a contribution that comes back to the council areas to ensure that it's not just collected and delivered within the whole of the region, that it's delivered where the population is going to, where the building is going to be and where the population will be living.
And just finally, I know we're out of time, but is your indication at this point that the Department of Planning and the Minister for Planning will be open? Have you got that kind of indication that is a dialogue, that is something that is invited to work out how to do this?
My understanding from council staff who are dealing directly with the departmental stuff, and really, I'll start by saying 8 Todd. I mean, there's an advantage at Crow's Nest in that we have done master planning work already, in that we've got the 2036 plan. The timing and the expedition of adopting these changes by the end of the year puts enormous pressure on the department as well as on councils and communities. And I don't know why it is so rushed, because we are in those 8 Todd precincts already delivering, and the market's not taking up what's already zoned. So there is time to be able to extend it to do some more detailed work and some better community consultation about a final version of the accelerated Todd precinct plan. I think that would allow some of the more nuanced good planning to happen. But what I will say is, I wrote to the Minister last week and asked for an urgent meeting to discuss this and also the recently announced housing targets. And I have a meeting date affirmed with him. So in terms of that, certainly that I think that's probably an indication that they're prepared to talk. It's really important that they're prepared to deliver on some amendments and modifications, because as Central Coast said, and I think pretty much every council who's impacted by either of the Todd programs, a one-size-fit-all approach is just poor planning. We need to have a response to the particular place and the particular context and the planning that's already being done in order to get the best outcomes.
Thank you. Our time's come to an end for this
Can
session.
I just ask one
I
quick
was going to
question,
say final
sorry.
things.
But just as a quick one to Mayor Baker, is it still your expectation this will go on public exhibition Q2 of this year?
My understanding, the last confirmation we've had from the department is that it's likely to be going on exhibition in July. I would expect that would be. I have no specific knowledge of this, but I would think it would be in late July. The work involved just to do a rush job is substantial.
No, thank you very much.
Thank you. If there were matters taken on notice, which I know there were a couple, the Secretariat will be in contact with you about those. Thank you very much for your time and your incredibly helpful evidence. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You. Welcome and thank you for making the time to come today and give evidence. Could I please get each witness to state your name, your position, title and swear either an oath or an affirmation, starting on my left would be great. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Michael Carnuccio, the Policy Manager at Community Housing Industry Association, New South Wales. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair and Committee. My name is John Brockhoff. I'm the National Policy Director at the Planning Institute of Australia. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Sue Weatherly, I'm the President of the Planning Institute of Australia for New South Wales, and I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help me God.
Thank you. And would anyone like to start by making a short opening statement?
Yes?
Thank
You
you.
started with the oath.
Okay.
You can start.
Yeah, please go ahead. Thank you.
Well, thank you to the committee for your invitation to appear here today. G New South Wales represents not-for-profit community housing providers, and our members provide homes for individuals and families who cannot afford to rent or purchase on the private market. And sadly, as the housing crisis worsens, an increasing number of people are finding themselves in that position. So without urgent, ambitious action, this dire situation will only get worse. So transport-oriented development represents an opportunity to address the housing crisis by delivering more homes in areas with good access to transport and services. And this is a sound and well-established concept. But to be effective, the focus needs to be on more than just overall supply numbers. It's not simply as easy as increasing the total amount of homes on the market. And even with the most ambitious of supply targets, it will not reduce housing costs sufficiently for those on the lowest of incomes. So we need to ensure that a range of housing products are delivered to address the full range of housing needs and to ensure that low-income households are not shut out of these communities due to a lack of housing options. And this includes essential workers in low-paying jobs that are critical to our productivity and well-being, for example, healthcare and childcare workers, retail and hospitality staff. So securing affordable rental housing within these precincts is essential to the success of the TOD program and doing density well. So Team New South Wales strongly welcomes and supports the inclusion in the TOD program of mandatory affordable housing requirements. Of course, we would welcome higher contribution requirements, but the 2% rate that has been introduced is a welcome starting point. And if gradually phased in, there's no reason why the rates couldn't be feasibly increased over time. And we welcome the New South Wales Government's commitment to doing just that. But in order to do that effectively, it's critical that a clear trajectory and time frame for increases is specified up front to ensure that developers can factor that into their feasibility and into future land purchases. I'll leave my statement there, but obviously welcome any questions.
Thank you. And would either of you like to make an opening statement?
Yes, I'll do, and I'll begin by just saying, I think I've been here before from other matters, and I always make the introduction that the Planning Institute represents planning and planners. We don't represent particular developers or whatever, and we are or councils or local government. We are a very broad church, so we represent planners who work in lots of different fields, including the community housing sector. And we have made a written submission, and I'll just perhaps take the opportunity to emphasise a couple of points in that submission. And we begin by saying that we do support the intent of the TOD program, to increase housing density in places well served by public transport. We support transit-orientated development that promotes more inclusive renewal and fulfils the spatial outcomes of an adopted regional strategy, and that probably is our key point, that both lots of TODs have come out, and even the housing targets, without a new adopted regional plan for Sydney, or a plan for Newcastle and Wollongong, to which the TOD SEP applies. The planning system primarily controls the location, ultimate capacity and scale of development, and not speed. While the TOD program can enable the right housing in the right places, it cannot get more housing constructed. Ensuring that the built forms and neighbourhoods meet long-term community needs is critical for this policy to be successful. The TOD program should be complemented by initiatives that promote sustainable design and amenity, as well as delivering of affordable housing and supporting infrastructure. Fundamentally, the TOD program should be led by a sound strategic plan which published supporting evidence to explain why the planning decisions were made. And it's important to note that the first phase of the TOD program has been released without an EIE, which in layman's terms is just a document, a narrative that explains the impact or the intended impact of the planning rules, and that lack of consultation as well. We think it may have been a better program if that work had been done. Merely zoning land for high density will not create successful TODs. It's also about placemaking, mixed use, being walkable, bike-friendly, closely integrated with mass transit by clustering housing, jobs, services and amenities around public transport stations. And this is why PIA has proposed integrating a master planning element to the TOD SEP, which removes the one-size-fits-all rezoning approach where the work can be progressed rapidly. And to some extent, the changes that have been put in place which defer some of the TODs to enable the council to do additional work reflects that intent. And of course, I make the point that the 8 accelerated precincts all include a master planning program as well. There also needs to be public investment in placemaking and the necessary infrastructure that supports vibrant communities. Where there needs to be higher standard public domain and upgraded public facilities and services. There's currently little detail about how this will be funded via the TOD program. and the current developed contribution schemes under the Act are inadequate. For example, you can collect money to build, to purchase the land for a community facility, but can't collect money to build it. It's one of those odd provisions of the Act. Where TOD controls apply to heritage conservation areas, I think the issue how the two controls work together needs greater clarity, and perhaps with some upfront master planning, some decisions could have been made earlier around that. And we do make the point that that upfront master planning may have ensured greater trust and transparency in and accountability in the process, so people understand. It also enables you to make decisions about where you're going to put open space, where you're going to put schools, or if you do need to do that, do you have capacity within the existing facilities and services. And from a peer point of view, we would always say that good planning is about both the process and the outcome. And we would support the government continuing to monitor the impact of the first round of TODs and make adjustments where necessary, and where possible, take an opportunity where to still do some additional master planning in those precincts, and certainly to support the councils to do so. We made a number of recommendations. Some have actually sort of already occurred, but the ones that would still be worth considering is identifying the stations included the TOD programs in an updated regional and city plan. Also, what's the next phase of development? We've been, what's come out is a program to deliver on 5-year housing targets. What happens after that? So we need to be thinking about that beyond this initial 5 years, and an updated regional plan could help us do that across the community, as well as build confidence and certainty for the development sector. Greater clarity about how local plans could be exempt from the TOD SEP. Clarifying the weight placed on existing merit controls in LEPs and DCPs, and the apparent inconsistencies with some SEPs. Introducing a pattern book to help in speeding up the process and improving the quality of design. We also made submissions around specifying a minimum lot size to encourage amalgamation of lots to get a better outcome on individual sites. Again, that would be supported by detailed master planning, because master planning not only tells you what additional facilities and services you need and how to deliver on that, but it also ensures you maximise development potential in an area by ensuring every site can be developed to its maximum potential by thinking about what's the best amalgamation of lots. And we support the community housing sector in their desire to ensure that we actually have a sustainable, affordable rental housing scheme out of this that doesn't just think about the initial 2%, but it allows for an ongoing increase in that affordable housing provision. Because, as we've said, there's building homes will not necessarily make them affordable for people who currently are in rental stress in the private market. We can't build enough homes to change that situation unless we're also building affordable rental homes, and we would encourage the government to consider how we can actually have an affordable rental housing target as well built into these schemes.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your submissions. They're very helpful. We've got some questions. I just want to start with, just while we're on that affordable housing, if we could. I mean, I think it's fairly broad criticism that and quite accepted that the 2% or the mandated and not necessarily in perpetuity is a problem in terms of the genuine capacity to deliver. We also just heard evidence from North Sydney Mayor. She said in her statement that the experience there is actually the more houses that they deliver and that comes online, the higher the price is happening right now. So is that a phenomena that you take for granted in the work that you do? And what is your suggestion about what this government should be doing right now in terms of affordable housing?
Look, there's certainly a lot that the government could be doing, and as I said in my opening statement, this is a welcome start. We haven't really had these sorts of requirements put in place over such a broad area before, so it's great to see that that's been put into place, and the evidence that we've included in our submission shows that when you start low and gradually build up over time, that's how you can get the best, most effective outcomes, and you don't impact the development viability. But certainly new development can displace existing low-cost housing if you're, particularly for infill development, if you're building on redeveloping an existing housing site and putting in place new apartments, then it's likely that those new apartments will be sold at a premium. But, you know, as I said in my opening statement, I think, you know, there's a lot of tensions here. Obviously, we need to see more homes being built. But for the households that our members house, the very low and low income households, you really need that dedicated product. You can flood the market with new supply, but that's not really going to reduce the prices enough for those households. And we've done some analysis, and in about 90% of local government areas in New South Wales, the housing is not affordable to very low income households. In 80%, it's not affordable to low income households. And we'd need to see drops of 50% or more in house prices in order for them to be affordable. And so you're just not going to be able to achieve that even with the most ambitious of targets. That's why we really need to see those dedicated products built. So as well as those planning levers, the government also obviously has fiscal levers. They can put funding towards more social and affordable housing, and we have been calling on the government to put forward a significant contribution. We've seen the federal government make some steps forward in that respect, so we're hoping now that the state government can also step up and in the forthcoming budget put a sizable funding package together for new social and affordable housing.
And so what are the reasons you've been given? I mean, your submission advocates for, supports the implementation of 15% of affordable housing requirement in the TOD accelerated precincts, and we've got 2%. Yep. So what's the reasons the government's given you for not following what you guys, who are the experts in understanding what we would need to be delivering something that would work for communities? What reasons have you been given?
The concern, I understand, is essentially not wanting to impact development feasibility. So to be able to do this in a pragmatic way so that you start somewhere and gradually build up over time.
So on that, we've heard from other people who have appeared at the hearings that it will be very difficult to comply with the 15%, and then that the 2% is possibly meaningless when you have a number of apartments that isn't going to allow even a single affordable apartment to be built as part of that development. So I presume that's why you're saying you actually need dedicated builds and dedicated sites for this. How do you see the 2% being overcome just from a numerical point of view? I mean, what do? You can't have half a house or a third of a house.
Correct.
But then, in addition, if 15% is not going to be financially feasible and does stop development, what's your read on both of those situations?
So I think just to explain a couple of things. So firstly, the 15% is for those 8 higher growth precincts. So the theory is because they're going to see a lot more uplift, they will be able to support a higher percentage. From a practical point of view, we were never going to get 15% in the 30 or so tier 2 precincts. Then there's a number of ways that you can deliver that contribution. Currently, in the reforms and the SEP that's been put in place, it has to be on-site provision. And that's where you get that complication, where it is such a low requirement. And that was an issue that we have raised with the government. And my understanding is that they didn't have another mechanism to be able to get a cash contribution in lieu of on-site provision. And I'm hoping now, through working with councils, that they can put in place local schemes that would allow a cash contribution, so that you don't have those complexities that you referred to. It's not, it's not just a complexity around how do you configure that floor space to actually get meaningful dwellings out of it. There are a whole range of other complexities from the management side and ongoing costs when you've got a lot of strata fees, when you're having to manage one home across multiple buildings. It's not very efficient, and you do then erode the benefits of that affordable housing. So certainly dedicated builds in the same areas will provide more benefits.
My
So-
understanding, I'm sorry.
Just to follow on, just to clarify, your understanding is that the department or the government will be looking to work with individual councils to develop individual schemes that relate to their provision.
That is my understanding, yes. So we are hoping the government will really help speed that process because it can be quite a time-consuming process. You have to amend your LEP as well as get together your administration processes to manage all those contributions. So we're hoping that there will be a lot of work to streamline that process. But yes, that's my understanding, that the councils will be able to introduce their own schemes.
Just to clarify, so I'm clear, the 2%, as I understand it, was for smaller sites with smaller densities, and the understanding is that that would increase over time. Is that correct?
Yes, the 2% is for the tier 2 precincts that would have up to 6 stories apartments.
Yep.
And yes, the intention is that that will increase over time.
Sorry.
I was just going to add on that point. I know John wanted to just add something on that. I think we've, together with a number of interested peak bodies in this matter, have suggested that the intention is good. It could be embedded in the SEP itself.
Yeah.
So that's a clear signal to the development sector that if you do your development now, it's 2%, but if you do development, say, in 5 years, it's going to be 5%, and then it could be 10% in 10 years or something. That signal to the development sector may very well help ensure that people pay, well, to put
Unless
simply,
it means they don't start at all.
Yeah.
well, they pay the
Use it
right,
or lose it, effectively.
or they pay the right price for the land.
Yeah.
If you're only, because it's now built-in cost, that issue, if you only set it at 2% and people start only allowing for a 2% whenever they buy land, then that won't become feasible. But if you get some longer-term market signal, that would help.
Because it's in perpetuity.
Yes, but it's also, that's right. And
But it's not at the moment.
But it's
No,
not
it
at the
is.
moment.
It is.
The 2%,
It is.
so
Okay.
It is in
2% in
perpetuity.
perpetuity
2%
and
in
15% for the tier 1.
But
That's
no
right.
growth in...
There's nothing that's been
Yeah.
there's nothing that
formalised in
has
that
been
sense.
published.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we're hopeful that will happen in the near future. But we need to see that for the reasons that Sue has pointed out. It needs to be embedded in the plan now.
And to your point, that's of advantage to you, but it's also of advantage to the development sector to be able to price it properly and to be encouraged potentially as well to actually activate these precincts quicker if they can get the feasibility to work on 2% but might not be able to on 5%, for instance.
That's right.
Excuse
Can I
me, Chair.
jump-
could I-
Yes, Mr. I know, Mr. Brock.
I was just going to
trying
ask,
say something.
the reason why we're talking about this is because we don't have the confidence that there's going to be a trickle down from private supply to properties that are affordable on the private rental market. So the notion is that we all want to increase supply in accessible places to provide homes for changing and future populations and provide that diversity of accommodation to meet everyone's needs. But the other reason that's understood around the expansion of supply is that if there's enough of it, and if enough of it is put on fast enough, that there'll be a suppression of the price of land to buy and the price of rents in the private market. Unfortunately, the research that the Planning Institute have looked into is that that's a very slow and uncertain process, that trickle down of new supply, or the rate, more importantly, the rate at which new supply comes on into the pricing of property. So we can't rely on more supply, particularly more supply if it comes on slowly, to really substantially reducing the price of housing to live in. So that's why we're having this discussion around the inclusionary zoning, or also the public's delivery of social housing, because the private market demand is so overheated that more supply can't come on fast enough or at scales enough that will suppress the price of housing in the private market to the point that it addresses the social concerns that Michael's been talking about. So that brings us to the discussion about what we can do as a society. Certainly more social housing, but also as private development takes place, we need to put a signal in there that there's an obligation to provide below market housing available to low and moderate income earners. So is it 2%? In perpetuity? Is it grow to 15%? These are all important questions, and PO strongly support the growth of the private industry's obligation to provide more housing that's available to rent for low and moderate income earners. Now, the question is, are those costs included in the price of housing and affect viability calculations now? And yes, they do, because right now, developers have already made a call on how much they're going to buy their raw sites for, and if you add 2% cost, then something's got to give. They either walk away from their options, or they take a 2% hit on their margins. But if it's signalled, and it's signalled progressively over time, the market has both the raw land owners and the developers have a market signal that in 5 years' time it might be 10% or whatever, and that they'll price that into the negotiations as it takes place, and presumably they want to keep their development margin of whatever it is, 18-20%, and that they'll only buy the raw land for the price that they can make the development happen. So that being the case, 2% is probably something that can be absorbed just in current negotiations, but over time you would be able to absorb a higher inclusionary zoning percentage if it was broadcast to the market, and if raw landowners were able to accept that due to the certainty and the understanding that the world has changed, and that the obligations for the delivery of low and moderate priced rental housing is an obligation that does fall on the private sector as well. So that's just a background, and it's fundamentally we're having this conversation because of the lack of trickle down from new development in the private market to low and moderate priced housing.
Would you accept that even in pricing into land acquisition and development, that the greater number of affordable housing dwellings you have, the more costly the non-affordable dwellings are going to be?
I would say no, because the price that you pay to buy or rent is set by the broader market. It's set by what people are willing to pay in that particular location, and often that's set based on the sale of second-hand stock, older stock. And a lot of the evidence says that those costs will be factored into the purchase price of the land, not added on to the purchase price for the finished product.
Mm-hmm. And just to emphasise that, I think it works out, the numbers are 95% of all sales, property sales, like people buying homes, are existing stock.
Yeah.
Less than 5% is new stock. So even if new stock was a lot cheaper than the current market, it's not going to have much effect on the market, the general market price. The times you see it does affect is when you have a lot of new stock in a particular precinct. It may affect price in that precinct, but it doesn't have an impact over the total price people are going to pay in the market for a home.
But we are
that's right. It's
talking
like
about
the tail wagging the dog.
Yeah.
But we are talking about specific precincts here.
Yes, but in terms of that total market, I hate speaking for a developer. I'm not a developer, but I've had some experience. I think the developers sell it for what the market is of the area. That's what they sell it for. And if you looked at the analysis from the UDIA, which came out yesterday, which I haven't read the full report, I did read the summary of this in the Sydney Morning Herald. It was showing that in some places the sites will redevelop relatively quickly, because the cost of construction, the cost of the land, plus all the government charges, still produces an adequate profit margin to deliver at the price people are willing to pay for that precinct. Whereas in other places, the price people are willing to live in that precinct is a bit lower than all those things combined. So they're going to take a lot longer perhaps to come on board than some of those other precincts. And I thought it was a really good analysis of that issue, that what will happen, and to get costs down, the biggest areas to tackle would be land costs and construction costs.
Yeah.
They were the two overwhelmingly large components of construction. Of delivery, sorry, not construction, delivery, which is a different thing.
It was a good graph. Can I just ask one final question, Mr. Carnuccio, about your mention of management of social and affordable housing, and essentially what is the best way to do that? And I guess I want to corroborate evidence that we've heard previously. I think it was from Mr. Forrest about the preferred management of social and affordable housing, it actually being more helpful to have it in one area rather than...
And we heard the same from Central Coast Council today as well, on
Yeah.
the basis, I think, of Pacific Link housing.
So just understanding if that actually is the case from your membership point of view.
That would be the preference.
Yeah.
Our members will make it work regardless of what the circumstances are. But the preference is to be able to have a sufficient number of properties to get those economies of scale, to get that efficiency in how those properties are managed. And certainly it's not very efficient when you're only having one property in one building, another one in the next door building. There's a lot of complexities. You're dealing with different strata schemes and all those associated costs. Whereas if it's a purpose-built building, the CHP will be able to design that from scratch, so they will take into account all of their ongoing maintenance requirements and design it accordingly, but they will obviously have full control of that building. So that creates a lot more efficiencies. And that also brings me on to the other issue that we would have liked to have seen in the SEP that wasn't reflected around ownership of those affordable homes. The current requirement is that the properties need to be managed by a CHP. We would like to see that ownership is transferred to the CHP, and that is typical in local government schemes, that when there is a mandatory affordable housing requirement in perpetuity, that ownership is transferred to either the CHP or the council. And the reason for that is it then creates an opportunity to leverage more homes in the future. Well, we've done some work. We had Paxton Group do some work for us, and they modelled what additional amount of homes can be leveraged, and it was something in the order of an initial 27% could be leveraged because they've got that asset that they can then use the equity of to help debt fund future affordable housing. So there's a lot of advantages in transferring that ownership.
Thank you.
Can I ask just one brief one? And that is, I understand that the department has recently introduced a concierge service for community housing providers. Can you tell us how that works, and is it of value to you?
I think it's value to some of our members. They've got about 20 CHPs signed up. I don't know the ins and outs of how it works. That would probably be a question for the department, but my understanding is that it will help the CHPs navigate planning system. So CHPs are quite a broad church. There are those who develop quite regularly, and there are those who do it less so often. So I think the concierge would really help those who aren't as familiar with the planning process and help them step through that process. I also understand that if there is a development application in the system and for whatever reason it gets stuck or there's an issue that arises, that they will help mediate that issue. So I think that would also be advantageous too. But it's not a fast track approval process. So we would certainly welcome measures to be able to approve those affordable homes faster so that they can get onto the ground faster.
Okay, thank you.
if I could just pick up, I think we all agree with transport-oriented development. It's just how we get there effectively. And I think that the Planning Institute makes some very good points in their submission about how to make this program better, and I do very much thank you for your positive recommendations with that regard. One of the comments you make in your submission is, and I'll quote, that there's a real risk that individual site conformance with SEP controls would actually lead to lower density and yield, less coordinated growth and poorer design than via a coordinated precinct plan. I was just wondering if you could perhaps outline why that's the case and whether you think the SEP in its final form does overcome some of these problems, or what you think we could do to overcome those challenges.
Well, I suppose, and I was sort of alluding to this challenge that the accelerated precincts, so the big ones,
Yeah.
the 1,200 metre precincts, actually taking that precinct master plan approach, because that is the best way to maximise development. And I'm a resident of Hornsby, so I'm a little aware of what Hornsby Council, and they've been working on their master plan around the station for some time. So they're quite keen to leverage off what the assistance with the government can actually effectively fast track what they've been working on for some time. And they would say that that process ensures that they can identify how to maximise the yield on individual sites. Because if you ever look at a map of Sydney and look at the property boundaries, who the hell drew that up? Because they're all sorts of shapes and sizes and with odd configurations. They aren't all perfect for a 6-storey, or in case of the small-scale TODs, they're not all perfect for a small-scale project such as 6 stories. So therefore, in a master planning approach, what you might look at is, rather than saying the minimum lot size for development is, say 2,000 square metres, which is a specified standard in the TOD, you might say, well then, for this area, if these two lots consolidated with this lot here, different size, it will maximise the density for that precinct because of the setbacks required. When you take into account the setbacks and other constraints of a particular site, you might want a larger site here, a smaller site works here. That's the advantage of that sort of master planning approach. And I'm fairly confident that's effectively what Hornsby Council's done in looking at its master plan around its station. So that's why we support that. We would say that opportunity is not lost in these precincts. Some of that master planning work can still be done. And of course, the state government's taken the opportunity to defer some of those introduction of the TODs, the small-scale TODs, 6-storey TODs, until I think it's 2025. I think is the last.
There's a gradient. There are some that are July. There are some that are September. There are some that are December. There are some that are out to 2025.
Yeah, that's right. And that is an opportunity to do that master planning, to say, well, in fact, perhaps it shouldn't be 6 stories here. It could be 8 stories here.
Yeah.
And 5 stories here, and they would get a better outcome in terms of both urban form but also maximise development opportunity. So that's why we're keen for that sort of precinct master planning, because this is a place-based response. That's what TODs are by their definition, place-based. It's the right response for that location. So there's still plenty of opportunities for doing that, and we would certainly encourage the councils to continue to look at that planning for their local area, and encourage the government to support the councils who want to do some more work. But that's why sometimes you get a better yield when you look at the total precinct and how you're going to put those sites together.
Yeah. And I think actually in their submission for the low and mid-rise changes, Canterbury Bankstown Council did a very good description of that and showing actually on an example of a site how that actually worked. And I found that very helpful in my understanding.
Yeah, like I say, no one would subdivide Sydney the way we've been subdivided. That's what we've got.
And just to pick up on that, and some of your, and one of your recommendations which was including a minimum lot size to encourage site amalgamation. Now, the government, of course, in their revision have put down a minimum lot width, but not a minimum lot size. Do you think that goes far enough, or do you think there still needs to be that minimum lot size that's in place to encourage that consolidation and the maximisation, perhaps, of that yield?
This is where I go, well, I haven't looked at all 35 station sites, and I'm going to say it would be impossible for me to say there would have been a better response for every one of those 35 precincts.
Yep.
We proposed a minimum lot size because when you consolidate lots, you can deal with side setbacks in particular better. Larger sites can actually deal with side setbacks better. Urban designers go in and they work out, how do we get that, because that's actually one of those things important for a local amenity and the amenity of the people living in the apartments in the future. It's a fallback position in the past has been just to say, well, it has to be a minimum lot size. That should get you a minimum lot frontage. That should be able to get a building on that. I assume the department has tested this, and that's the basis for their...
Assume nothing we say.
And therefore they've worked that out, and it is because... almost to do the minimum lot size. From a planning point of view, I think it's better as a minimum lot size. Sure. Others may think you can manage it perfectly with a minimum lot width.
Yeah.
But the minimum lot width, you have to be clear about what you're trying to achieve on the site.
And from memory, the minimum lot width is 21 metres. Would you think that'd be sufficient to be able to...
In some cases it may, but how big's the lot?
For depending on the sites, indeed.
Yeah, well, what if it gets very narrow at the back? Like I say, look at a subdivision plan for Sydney. No one would ever do that, but that's what we've got.
And can I just ask, is it so in terms of that, is that where deep soil comes into it and canopy, and that's where we kind of fail to deliver if we're not getting that right?
Yes, that's right. Most councils have also DCP controls, which will still apply in these circumstances.
Will they? Sorry, I didn't mean that like that. I think there's still, we keep hearing that, yes, they'll apply, but there's going to be challenges,
I would also,
is what we're hearing.
I think of recent times, the Secretary of the Department's talked about the need to continue to monitor impacts and outcomes, and we would certainly encourage that as an outcome as well.
But
to make sure.
So in terms of that, though, we just heard evidence from the council strategic planners from, say, Central Coast, and we've heard this in previous hearings, but at the end of the day, if you've got a litigious, opportunistic, motivated developer who is going to test the upper ends, let's call them, of the TOD set versus a DCP, then it's likely the developer will prevail, or there will just be lengthy litigation to test that, and that burden will fall on councils.
And the short answer to that is yes, but the government should be monitoring that. So if that's the case, and we're ending up with the outcome not intended, then there's opportunities to update the SEP. And how it operates.
Then sorry to, but that just get a bit active, but. At the end of the day, though, it's not the practice to retrospectively amend SEPs to then apply to developments that are, and that's what we call runaway
right.
consequences.
Can't deal with the stuff that's already been approved, but I could wander around Sydney and I could say, same issue in terms of development. You'd say, rules there, but. So yes, it would be better, and that's the advantage of the master planning. Looking at these areas as a place-based solution. There's time to do some of that in some of these precincts. The other day, the Planning Institute ran a living in denser housing lived experience, and one of the sort of the feedbacks we got from that was some of these precincts will take a long time to get going simply because of current conditions for those areas. So it is time to do some of that master planning, and we would certainly encourage both the councils and the state government to support each other to try and get some of that master planning happening.
So just with your reference to that you did, whatever that was, it sounds very interesting, the lived experience of living in density. Is that something that's publicly available, the results, or is that...
There will be a recording available.
There will be a recording available. We looked at things such as the design of housing or denser housing to suit families, the move away from simply two-bedroom apartments. You need to think about that. We also looked at the problems with the strata title laws and how difficult that is. It also disadvantages sometimes community housing providers when they're a single owner in an apartment building. We looked at other factors, and the fact that all these TOD sites are quite different, and that's where the master planning or the precinct-based approach is a good way to go. And it was one of the developers who did make the point there's probably time to do it because some of these precincts will take a little while to get going.
Chair, could I make just a comment on... Scott Farlow made the question about can you achieve similar yields with master planning, and I just want to make the point, just using a really simple example around overshadowing and also possibly privacy. If you have taller buildings at the southern end of the block, if you have taller buildings at the northern end of the block, they're going to successively overshadow buildings further away. Whereas if you have taller buildings on the southern end of the block, everyone could conceivably meet their overshadowing requirements, and with good design and sufficient lot area, you could deal with privacy issues. So the simple advantage of master planning is that you can maximise the density where there's the least overshadowing, and you can orientate and work around some of the privacy issues. So it gives you more flexibility to avoid some of the litigious concerns that you raised. That if you have the master planning on a precinct basis, you can probably have taller buildings in some parts of the precinct, and maybe shorter ones at the northern end. Manipulate and optimise your site amalgamation planning, and optimise the location of your building footprints to get a better result for everyone, and probably get more density.
So rather than having 6 stories across the floor, you've got maybe 10 and 4.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you have 6 stories across the board, somewhere along the line, someone's going to miss out, because they're going to be the ones that are overshadowed. I mean, if you've got the second one behind the 6-story building and you're on the south side, you're going to be struggling potentially in court over how you address the DCP requirements or the guidance of the ADG.
And it's the last person who would create the overshadowing may very well miss out.
Miss out, that's right.
Or they have to have a much lower development to deal with the overshadowing issues, or they have to increase setbacks, which reduces yield. So that's why looking at a total precinct has that advantage from a yield point of view, but also has the advantages of all the other infrastructure we need to support, some of which will be trees, for example.
Indeed, and there might be a park at one end of the block, and you might want more density up that end of the block to exploit that advantage.
Okay, I'm noting the time, and this has been a very, very helpful session. Thank you very much. We are out of time. So if anything was taken on notice, the Secretariat will be in contact with you. But thank you very much for all of your time and giving the evidence today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll take a short break and be back at 11 o'clock. Thank you.
written it, but the first sentence is going to be...
Okay, welcome and thank you for making time to give evidence today. Could I please start with each witness stating your name, position, title and swearing either an oath or an affirmation, and we'll start with you, Mr. Morton.
Sam Morton, General Manager of Government Corporate Affairs at Business New South Wales, and I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Mustafa Aga from Business New South Wales, Executive Manager of Policy. I solemnly, sincerely and truthfully declare and affirm that the evidence given now and about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Brendan Coates, Economic Policy Program Director at the Grattan Institute, and I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
I'm Peter Tulip, Chief Economist at the Centre for Independent Studies. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Would anyone like to start by making an opening statement?
Sure, happy to kick off.
Thank you. Please go ahead.
Good morning, Chair. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Thank you for having Business New South Wales here today to talk about housing and transport-oriented development. Business New South Wales represents almost 50,000 members across New South Wales, businesses of all sizes in every region. Our organisation is one of the lead organisations of Housing Now as well, an alliance under the guidance of one of our executive directors, David Borger. The alliance put in a submission 60, and that alliance has brought together business, civil society and unions all together to work on an issue. It's not often that you see a group like that, so that really stresses the importance of this. Our members have continually told us that the communities are struggling with the affordability of housing, and as a result, they're often unable to find the appropriate workforce due to house prices. In our latest business conditions survey, released just last week, a survey check on the operating environment in New South Wales, our members ranked housing as the second most important investment priority for the government, right after energy reliability and costs. This is ahead of transport, education and a range of other issues. The lack of affordable housing and insufficient supply of housing, respectively, has been one of the biggest reasons that is driving skill shortages in our regions as well. We've all heard about the cleaners who had to traverse the city for a job and the teachers who are living further away than ever from their schools. This is not what a strong functioning economy has. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll go to Peter Tulip next.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Tulip.
Thanks. Sydney has a housing affordability crisis, for which the solution is increased density. That's the central finding of a whole series of official reports, backed up by a large quantity of good evidence. As just one example of this, the New South Wales Productivity Commission estimated that planning restrictions increased the cost of the average Sydney apartment by 59%. And there are lots of other studies showing very similar effects, some of which I'm actually responsible for. We're here today to discuss the Transport-Oriented Development Program, which effectively helps to address this problem. So it should be supported. But what I've just been saying about housing supply having big effects on affordability, I have to acknowledge that that's not well understood by the general public. And those misunderstandings are a serious obstacle to better housing policy. So I think inquiries like this can and should do a very valuable role in correcting some of those misunderstandings, which I hope you do in your final report. The affordability crisis is urgent. Families are sleeping in tents and cars. So I think it's understandable, desirable even, that policy has been hurried and we haven't had as much consultation as ordinarily we'd like. Now, the TOD's necessary because past policy was failing, and that's a central point that really needs emphasis. The previous policy of letting councils decide on new housing was leading to growing shortages and increasing prices. So the state government needs to tell councils what housing to approve. And the TOD does that while setting out a clear and detailed alternative to the status quo. I think there's room for disagreement about precise details, but in my view, the thrust of the New South Wales Government's housing reforms, of which the TOD is a central part, is what we need to make housing affordable. And I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll actually issue the opportunity to make an opening statement because Peter has summarised that very well, and it's probably better to use the time for questions.
Okay, thank you. We've got a series of questions, but I'll throw to my colleagues over here. Mr.
Sure.
Farlow.
I'll start off. Mr. Tulip, you talk about the challenge in terms of public understanding affordability and how supply impacts affordability. What would you like to demystify, so to speak, in this process?
I think it just needs to be said clearly that increased supply reduces the cost of housing, and the frequent arguments to the contrary that I think you heard in your first day of hearings.
We did. That's right, Mr. Tulip. That's exactly what we heard, and we heard that this morning.
So I didn't hear this morning's session, but I did hear the first day session from the Friends of Ku-ring-gai Environment and the Haberfield residents, basically saying that supply and demand doesn't work in the housing market, that you can increase supply without it reducing the cost of housing. And there's just an enormous amount of evidence to the contrary of that. I mean, I don't think you can get any respectable economist that will agree with the Friends of Ku-ring-gai or the Haberfield residents. So there are just errors out there that need to be dispelled.
So, Mr. Tulip, just on that though, how does that work in a current context when we've heard so much evidence that no matter what we're kind of doing now in terms of increasing density through the planning system, changing zonings, that we won't improve, the delivery won't come online in real terms, given the real circumstances we're experiencing. This is not a theoretical exercise, and that supply in any form will not likely come on for another 10 or so years in terms of the actual delivery. How do you grapple with that in this framework?
There certainly are some pockets of the housing market, few in Sydney, more numerous in other states, where constraints other than planning matter. And they have, without those planning constraints, they have much more affordable housing, and prices are close to costs, so costs matter. It was just in Channel 9 News yesterday, a report in Roseville, just a few blocks from where I live, a real estate agent saying that developers are going to be offering $12 million for each house that they can buy near Roseville Station. Why are they paying such huge amounts of money? It's only because they wanted to build housing on it. I mean, it doesn't make sense to pay $12 million for a block of land and just keep it the way it is. They have plans to change it.
Could I please drill down on that a little more? Because we heard in the last session that actually the rate of increase in dwellings will not match the need. So actually the kind of demand supply curve isn't getting any better, because despite the possibility of having more dwellings, which I think we do all want, there will simply not be enough to actually give the market more than it needs, or at least rebalance the kind of equilibrium point.
So there are other constraints in the housing market. Finance is one, labour is another. I think the clearest indication we can have of what will happen if we do a citywide upzoning is what's happened in New Zealand, where they've allowed medium density housing in most of Auckland. Lower Hutt, which is just outside of Wellington, also de-liberalised its housing restrictions a few years ago, and construction's exploded in both cities. By which I mean it's gone up incredibly quickly. Construction doubled in Auckland, more than that in Lower Hutt. The experience we have is that relaxation of zoning restrictions leads to a boom in construction, followed soon after by substantial reductions in housing costs.
There are
That's
criticisms
the experience.
Yeah, there's
of
some
that.
pretty wide criticisms coming online now with the experience of New Zealand. Sorry.
I wanted to push back on that.
Right.
That the criticisms that I have read, in particular by
Cameron Murray.
Cameron Murray and Tim
And Mr.
Hill
Coates might want to pick up on this one. Dr. Coates, I think perhaps...
have been pretty thoroughly rebutted. And if you talk to experts from New Zealand, the overwhelming consensus of New Zealand economists and New Zealand planners and from all different parties is that what's happening in Auckland is a huge increase in construction and very large reductions in housing costs. So, and those bloggers that you referred to before, their views have been seriously challenged, to which they haven't responded. Serious errors in their analysis have been pointed out by numbers of economists, and they're not defending their original objections. So I don't think weight should be placed on that blog.
If I could jump in there, since you've
I've invited
this,
you to,
thank you.
so to speak. Yes.
Look, I want to take this from first principles first before we get to the specifics of the sort of tit for tat in the sort of academic literature, which is that, you know, we all agree we want more housing. Yeah. We all agree Sydney has a housing crisis where rents are skyrocketing and vacancy rates are at record lows, and it's having all these effects that many people have talked about the impacts of. You know, a city without grandchildren, people in their 30s and 40s leaving Sydney for elsewhere, reducing economic dynamism and rising homelessness. You know, I think the basic principle is if the government has signed up to targets to build 377,000 new homes over 5 years through the National Cabinet Housing Plan, they are ambitious targets. They will be difficult to meet. If you don't upzone to allow more housing to be built, then you've got no chance of meeting them. If you do upzone to allow more housing to be built, then you've got some chance of meeting them, and certainly you'll get closer to them than where you otherwise would be. You know, I think the experience we see is that if you allow more opportunities for housing construction, so you need zone capacity to be much larger than, you know, what you expect population growth to be, housing demand, because it allows opportunities for different groups in the community to go and build housing, new developers to come in, and expansion of the development sector. It's how you'll get an expansion in the construction workforce and construction capacity. And without that, you're really going to struggle. So it seems to me it's a choice between we can do the thing that looks like it's going to have a pretty good chance of, it's going to shift the needle to get us close to the outcome, you know, preventing people from ending up being homeless. Even if we don't hit the full target, we reduce rents and prices compared to where they otherwise would be. Or we can continue with the status quo, which I think Peter summarised really well, has not been effective in achieving kind of the housing needs, meeting the housing needs of Sydney. Now, on the specifics, look, there is a debate about the counterfactual world in which some of those New Zealand studies, like what was the appropriate counterfactual to estimate the impact of the upzoning that's taken place there. You know, that's going back and forth. I think most economists would certainly still subscribe to the idea that more housing, that upzoning has led to more housing in New Zealand because the original authors have responded. Other housing economists, which I greatly respect, have come in and suggested that those issues, that what we've seen in the response from the original authors addresses a lot of those concerns. So I think prima facie, if you're asking, you know, where does the weight of opinion sit, what's going to lead to more housing, then upzoning without it, you're just going to struggle to get anywhere near what we need as far as housing goes in Sydney.
Can I ask, just on the same vein, in relation to the TOD program, can I ask the Business New South Wales, do you have any views on whether or not that policy will help achieve some of the objectives that we've just been talking about?
Thank you, Chair, and through the Chair. A general point before we jump straight back into the TOD, I think the line of questioning itself highlights decades of incremental policy failure. So we have a housing market that is in raw crisis, particularly for people who are unable to access the capital to get into it, let alone even just the renting end of the spectrum. So we're really talking about 30, 40 years of incremental issues that have finally arrived, needing to be addressed desperately. These targets haven't come out of nowhere. We can't unravel the banking reforms of the early 80s that unleashed property prices skyrocketing in this country. We can't undo a number of things that have left the demand side running so hot. But we have this gaping supply side problem on the housing front that we just need to address. And this is where, from our perspective, which we'll unpack, and Mr. Arger will get into some more, right down to the detail as much as you like today, we just have a once-in-a-generation problem that has arrived. The housing market in every major housing market in Australia is the least affordable in the history of the country. We are so far from that 1950s Menzian dream. We're a million miles from the public housing schemes of the 60s. We are a million miles from the boom in apartment building that happened in Sydney in the 30s and in the 70s. All of these things have arrived before, but they are so much more acute now. And that's the context in which all solutions are on the table, from how you manufacture housing to how you finance it to whether it's public housing. You want to jump in?
Yeah, look, we definitely do agree this program will have a significant impact on rent and cost of purchasing an apartment. However, you're building a metro system in every part of Sydney at the moment. Those are well-located places that can get people to jobs quickly. Metro West, once it's open, will expand the job catchment by 600,000 jobs in Olympic Park. That means people will be able to get to their jobs quicker. They'll have well-located houses for that. So yes, definitely agree. And the program has a limitation at the moment, but we think every station has some capacity for upzoning no matter where they are. Heavy rail, metros all work well to get people back to the CBDs and to where the jobs are. So we definitely agree with the program. And it was one of the elements that we put into the Housing Alliance when it was first launched a year ago.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask about Housing Now and the activities that you've been undertaking to engage with the community. Obviously, you've got a number of different organisations who have different expertise and different connections. So I just wanted you to talk through some of that, if you can, in relation to the TOD, if you've had much engagement specifically through Housing Now.
Yep. So not here as official Housing Now spokesperson, just as one of the lead organisations on that. In terms of activities, we haven't undertaken anything specific around transport-oriented development recently, but it was one of those ones where through different surveys, everything else that we've done, it was one of the ones that was an easy win. We've seen the Productivity Commission's report around where to build housing cheaply. As a Western Sydney resident, we've seen many estates that are built out very far. Those are long commutes to jobs. So everything that we saw from our surveys, from talking to members, transport-oriented development makes sense. And also the flip side is business districts. Having well-located well-located houses on these transport nodes means that the business districts will also thrive as well. So we have pressure from a few angles, but there's no recent activities that we've specifically taken around it.
Just to pick up on that point on business districts. So we heard from North Sydney Council this morning about Crow's Nest and about the importance of business being there as well and having a jobs target as well as a housing target. I know we heard previously in our last session as well from Macquarie Park and City of Ryde in terms of that innovation district. What's your view in terms of how we co-locate jobs and housing together, but that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, and that we don't have them in competition with each other?
Look, that is a complex question, probably beyond what we've done work-wise, but what we can say is that there is space for both. And well-located jobs close to these nodes are what's important. Our previous thought leadership, looking at closer to home and closer to talent, called for hubs in these areas. So there is space for both. Increasing the height limits of these buildings means there's probably capacity for both. A lot of these train stations at the moment were zoned around B4 zonings, and there's other capacities to have both. Other work that we've done around revaluing the CBD called for mixed-use buildings. So it's a building that can hold commercial and residential at the same time, and there's capacity for that with the right zonings as well. So there is a mix for both. Both will thrive at the same time, and both can feed each other.
Can I add a thought to that?
Yes.
The overwhelming excess demand for floor space in Sydney is for residential. That people pay huge amount for residential floor space, whereas office floor space is going cheaply and the price of it is actually falling at the moment, whereas residential is going way up. That's because there's a big excess demand for housing, particularly because of the pandemic, much less so for office space. I mean, there's a shortage of both, but it's much worse for residential. The other problem, a huge problem we have in Sydney is that a lot of our housing is going on the outskirts. People are living a 2 or 3 hour commute to jobs in the centre. Good planning would bring them close together. That means stopping putting all the offices in the inner suburbs, allow some of the work, the commercial space, to go out to the suburbs, which is where people live, and shorten the commutes. It doesn't make sense having so much housing going so far away from where the work is.
But in a sense, isn't that what's happened in some of these precincts? So Macquarie Park, for instance, is out further in the suburbs. If you look at the Norwest, you've got Norwest Business Park and that, and co-location. So
exactly.
that is sort of happening.
That's what we should be encouraging, and the more we leave it to the market, the more that will be happening. But I do want to push back on the idea of requiring office space in Crow's Nest and inner located spaces like that.
Thank you. Sorry for running over you.
I was going to ask about the Macquarie Park Innovation District as well, because actually I was at a report launch a couple of weeks ago that Business New South Wales was involved in about innovation districts, and I think you've already answered that to an extent to say that you think they should be co-located. So does that mean you increase density further, or like when you say they can be co-located or they work together, is it actually about increasing even more density, and say you have even more density in the Sydney CBD, for example, or Parramatta CBD, and actually just really concentrating density in highly urbanised areas?
As a broad principle, yes, we would call for greater density. Other work that we've done across the organisation has called for greater residential activity in the Sydney CBD as well. As part of our election platform, Business Sydney put out a target for doubling the CBD population over the next decade as well. So completely. There is space for greater density on most of our nodes. So as a broad principle, yes. Westmead, Liverpool, Macquarie Park are all great innovation districts that will thrive by having people living in that community as well, so that they can then have those, what we call the interactions that then spark innovation. So yes, there's capacity for both.
Thank you.
If I could just pick up in terms of, when we talk TODs, there's two tiers. There's tier 1 and tier 2. Do you have any, I guess, across all the panel in terms of any preference in terms of the programs and what you think would actually deliver more housing and greater yield?
Well, the tier 1 clearly delivers more. I mean, it's much higher density. It does require more infrastructure, and my understanding is the government would have declared more tier 1 density, tier 1 areas if they had more money. And this is one area where federal government support would help. A bit more help from the federal government in terms of infrastructure would facilitate building a lot more housing in Sydney through more tier 1s. And I think people talk about Edgecliff and Bondi Junction being two the leading sites.
I think you made a comment about the water infrastructure capacity in your submission,
yeah. And it's a lot of it is an infrastructure problem which should be solvable with a bit of money. I mean, I can talk more about water if you want.
Well, look, I would maybe invite you in the next question, but I'll let the rest of the panel in that. Yeah.
Sure.
Mr. Coates, have you got a view on that at all?
No, I think what we need is more housing as much as we can get it. So, you know, both those programs are going to deliver more housing close to where people want to live, consistent with what we see in the survey evidence. When you ask people where they would like to be, more people would prefer to choose to live in an apartment or a townhouse if it meant being closer to their place of employment and being able to afford that, than compared to being on the suburban fringe, which is otherwise the option. But no, I don't have a view as to which of those two parts of the program is better, but essentially we support any attempt that moves us closer to getting the benefits of density, both for affordability and for the substantial other benefits that arise from density. It's not just about cheaper housing. It's going to be it's going to be more. It's going to be a lower carbon footprint in the long run if you do it this way. It's going to probably lead to better social outcomes because you have less social isolation on the urban fringe. It allows, you know, those communities to grow. We don't find, in fact, in the research that density, in fact, diminishes community, rather the opposite.
And from Business New South Wales perspective?
Look, there's tier 1 makes sense. There's a greater capacity for development of those. I think what we need to look at is where else they can go. Metro stations make sense. They're quick. They're world class. There's not enough TODs on those stations as well. So that's kind of our long-term view.
I might just add, I mean, you mentioned North Sydney Council and Crow's Nest earlier, and as a local resident who a few decades ago, showing my age, went to school in the local area, it is a world apart. The development of that particular area might be a bit visually challenging as you drive west down Holterman Street looking at St Leonard's, but the vibrancy of the community, the retail precinct, the services, the medical services, the schools that have opened under the previous government. It was only 20 years ago that schools were closing, that retail was stagnating, that the general quality of life, which if there hadn't been development, may well have struggled, to be honest. And look, it is a really good lived and breathed example of what's coming, but also what needs to be done well.
Can I maybe just
Yes,
jump
please.
in? Mr. Coates, in your submission, you make a number of recommendations about other things the government could do. Could you just briefly elaborate on those for us?
Certainly. Obviously, building more and upzoning is the number one priority as far as getting more housing built, because that's where we see the biggest constraint being at the moment. But it's not the only thing you might want to do. There are other complementary measures that would also improve affordability. In the process of building more, we need to make sure that what gets built is of good quality. So if you're in a world where, a development is a one-shot game, once it's built, it stays there for decades, you want to make sure that what gets built is good. That's why things like the pattern books being put forward by the New South Wales government are potentially very valuable, because they ensure that we get better quality design, because that does have impacts on neighbours, alongside not just how tall the building is, but what it looks like and how well it's built. So that's certainly one. We can, in the process of allowing greater density, there is the prospect, as Victoria has done, to use windfall gains taxes as a way of capturing more of the zoning uplift. That is something that we certainly support. The evidence on those suggests that it doesn't tend to reduce the amount of development you get. In fact, it's reducing any potential windfall gain to the existing landowner, and make sure that it's a source of revenue that, frankly, as a tax economist as well, is amongst the most efficient that you could secure, to be able to fund the kind of changes to infrastructure that we will need to support more growth in those communities. In the same way as the ACT government's had a lease variation charge of 75% of the land value uplift for 3 decades. And there is actually, at the moment, we're in a world where obviously there's 3 big constraints. There's financing frictions as interest rates have risen, there are material shortages or price spikes, and there are labour issues. It's very hard to deal with material price spikes without just slowing down the pace of alternative demands for those resources, such as by slowing the pace of future infrastructure, as the Victorian government started to do, thankfully. When it comes to financing frictions, though, there is a role for getting more social housing built now. It would be a way of trying to bring forward, overcome some of those financing frictions by getting government to build more housing itself, or to fund and finance the construction of housing. And we obviously have a shortage of social housing in the community right now, where people who do need that support, that are otherwise at severe risk of homelessness, can't get that benefit. And then finally, there is, I think, a conversation to have about whether a public developer can play more of a counter-cyclical role in housing policy. Landcom exists, but it doesn't do all that much at the moment. And one thing I would observe is that construction is a very risky business. There's cascading arrangements of subcontractors and the like, essentially to avoid being caught holding the can if things go south in a development, and the risks on the balance sheets of these businesses can be quite big. So a role a government developer could play is to smooth out that construction cycle, de-risking development. And one of the big benefits is in the situation where you in fact have a recession or a downturn, instead of giving first home buyers grants to people to build kitchens or swimming pools or anything else, as we've done recently, you could in fact ramp up the pipeline for that public developer. You could buy out sites from developers that are struggling with finance, and you would get more housing smoothed over the construction cycle in the long run.
Can I ask the same question to the other witnesses, please?
Mr. Tulip, what's your view on that?
I can think of 100 things I'd like to do with housing policy, but I completely agree with Brendan. Zoning restrictions are by far the biggest one. I think I mentioned earlier, the planning restrictions increase the cost of an average apartment in Sydney by 60%. A lot of these other things that Brendan is talking about, I agree with, but they're worth 1 or 2 or 4% to the cost of housing. It's just tiny relative to the effect of planning restrictions. And so, while I admire the length of the Grattan Institute reports, there is a danger of losing focus on what is the central issue. it's in the papers at the moment, so I will mention, superannuation for housing. I think is a very, very good idea that it satisfies a lot of the objectives of our current superannuation scheme, but also solves a lot of obstacles to housing affordability. But you can't do it until and after you've solved the supply problems. Otherwise, it just increases demand and puts up prices. So it's a very good idea, but you need to get the sequencing right, and the sequencing is fixed planning restrictions.
We should catch up for a coffee after.
Well, we conveniently finished just before lunch.
Yeah, we can do that today.
Can I ask?
Yes,
Yeah, sure.
Caesar.
Look, the Housing Now platform goes into a few of those things. The design pattern book, much like Brendan said, I think is a great thing. It allows that medium density, the missing middle, to really get up really quickly. Much of the greatest parts of Sydney that we appreciate and love now are old pattern books, so we really back that in. There's some work that we understand is taking place at the moment. Anything to speed that up, any investment that can take place in that space would be really welcome. The other one is just looking at clearing the backlog, investing in the planning system to ensure that there's enough planners to process all these things. We can have as many aspirations in the water as we want, but if there aren't the appropriate people in planning to approve these in local councils in the department, we're not going to get anywhere where we need to be. But I might just leave it there. Happy to just mention having the appropriate council incentives for the local infrastructure as well. Many councils are bleeding out at the moment. They're not financially in a financial position to invest in the appropriate social infrastructure, and so we've got a tale of a few different councils that have very different experiences, from libraries, pools, school halls. So it's important to have those good, thriving local communities as well.
Chair, I think what we're describing is very much on the supply side. With great respect to the super suggestion, we've had 30 years of basically putting petrol on house fire, on the fire of house prices through first home buyer grants and things like letting people access their super or diminish the super pool and crank up house prices even further, unless, as our colleague said, we address the supply side issues.
Some of the things, it would be very hard to reconcile. We've had a lot, we've heard evidence in this particular hearing, but in others, talking to councils now in the last few months who say that they are absolutely on track in terms of actually having their approvals. There are so many ready to go developments for housing sitting in their LGAs and people just aren't building. So it's just in conflict with what absolutely, there are certain councils that, might be slower than others, but across the board, all the councils that we have heard evidence from are saying, if you go to the books and open them up, they'll show you that they've got DAs approved all over the shop, ready to go, and they're just not coming online. So that is just in direct conflict with some of the suggestions you're making here. How do you want us to reconcile that? Mr. Coates.
Sue, I think that's a great question, if you don't mind. So I don't think that they're in contradiction at all. I think what we see is clearly in the development process, you see strategic behaviour. You see developments that don't go ahead because the development approval might stack up, but the developer can't actually make that project work at the prevailing price of materials and everything else. That's certainly what's happening right now. But the question I think you need to ask is, all else equal, does upzoning more land for more housing give you a greater flow of housing in the long term? And I think the answer to that is very clearly yes. So if you think of Auckland before the upzoning in 2016, it had zone capacity, I think, of about 1.5 times what was expected to be the demand for housing over the following couple of decades. In the process of doing that, they increased it to something like 2.5 to 3 times zone capacity, and they saw the boost in housing that certainly we see and are convinced by did happen. So if you want to see more housing arising from this process, allowing more zone capacity is the best way to do it, because it de-risks and diversifies the development process. You will see an expansion in the number of developers who's doing it. Mums and dads can do more of it in a world where you don't need to have expertise at how to get the thing through the council in the same way. So, Chair, I don't think those two things are in conflict.
But I think the context of the conflict is much deeper than just that analysis. You've got those that are providing this evidence are explaining that those development approvals have come at great depth, great strategic planning, lots of consideration for all of the things that make, places, I'm just trying to think of the words this morning that were given so they're not my word, but, going to the livability criteria. And this is not just about, a theoretic exercise about housing numbers. This is actually about people and places that are healthy and places that people want to really live. And so I think the evidence comes with a much more breadth and context about, just delivering more houses. I understand that if that's what we're doing, perhaps you're right in that context, but I don't think anybody that we've heard from wants to and I don't think you do either, just deliver more housing. I think the idea is that everybody that's come before this committee wants more than just houses and housing numbers. We want houses that are well located, well designed, and really, really livable with all the things we need. So it's that context where I think that is the, I'm trying to cavil with in terms of that submission or that evidence.
One thing, and Mr. Arga might expand on this one, we're at a time with high inflation, massive cost. If ever there was a moment in time for innovation in how we actually build dwellings and bringing that innovation to market, that's very much now. If we want to have those amazing modern design, you don't necessarily want to be building everything the same way they did in the 1930s or the 1950s, and taking full advantage for anyone who's tried to get a renovation done lately. I don't know, it's pretty intimidating. The general
One going on at the moment.
Yeah,
Leaking
good
roof.
luck.
Yeah.
And no, in all seriousness though, whether that's manufactured housing, whether that's the design phase, whether it's the pattern book we've been speaking about, all of those design issues that bring cheaper unit costs to bear, it's tough right now. Borrowing costs for average homeowners have gone up 172% since the lows of the pandemic. We're crying out for innovation. We have very full employment. We have a skills shortage. It's pretty challenging building things the old way. It's definitely timely to have a look at a new way of doing it.
Yep. Look, on the council question as well, financing is always a hurdle to getting some of these developments going. Inflation being what it was and the cost of construction going up, even a year and a half delay in approving a DA means the cost of construction has significantly changed. Timeliness is important. We see other states do it really well and really quickly, and getting that lodgement to approval down to as quick as possible will help get more of those DAs built. Not every DA is going to get built no matter what you do in the system. That's just part of the system. Developers will often get land rezoned and just want to sell it. They've made their money, they're happy to move on. However, timeliness is important to getting that going. But also there's an issue with financing at the moment where some developments require 50 to 70% of the development to be sold first before you can get any money from the financing. So there's some innovations taking place in there. There might be a greater role for the federal government to play in that space, but there's a few hurdles. This is a complex problem, but you put the mosaic together and hopefully you can have a beautiful glass solution.
A beautiful what, sorry?
A beautiful glass window solution to everything. It's a tough thing. It's a mosaic and you put it together.
Yeah. Yeah.
Chair, if I could just respond briefly, because I think this is going to the crux of the debate around what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to achieve communities in which people can have shelter, where they can have somewhere to live, that are also vibrant, fun, exciting, interesting, cohesive places to live. I think it's no coincidence when you look around the world, Australian cities are not very dense. Melbourne and Sydney, for cities of their size, amongst some of the least dense in the world. Now, that is a result of a process of planning that has led us to this particular point. Now, we need planners, we need the planning system to mediate land uses. That's really important. We just haven't got the balance right. And when you look around the world at cities like Vancouver, Toronto, Vienna that have higher density than Sydney or Melbourne, they outrank Sydney on quality of life measures. So it's certainly not the case that housing should come at the expense of those things. We think they go together. And, I think we have a pretty strong evidence base that over the last 20, 30 years, the system that we've had, which has represented the interests of often a minority of residents in the local community, in particular councils, has not led to what's in the public interest, which would be more housing. Now, is there a nirvana where we see high quality planning leading to a great sort of master plan, leading to sort of the extra housing that we need, perhaps. But I think we shouldn't have a high hope that, you know, the existing processes, if we allow them to continue to run, are going to lead to a different outcome than what we've seen in the last couple of decades.
I've just got two more things, and I'd be very interested in your views. So one is, you know, in Sydney we have, and increasingly so, we have heat as a primary consideration in all planning and all development and all housing and all livability factors. In terms of heat, we've heard really good, strong evidence that canopy cover is essential. How do you get that if you don't have land use and planning controls is something I'd love to hear from you. Yes, Mr. Tulip.
Yeah, so the biggest enemy of tree canopy in my area, Roseville is my suburb, is overhead wires. And that there are zoning controls relating to deep soil, which are actually fairly small and minor relative to the problem of wires. It means that for most of my suburb, I'm taller than a lot of the trees.
Yeah.
And you can, and the solution is to bury the wires, but that's costly, and it's very costly to do as a one-off project. But if you're essentially demolishing an old block of houses to put in new apartments, then you're digging everything up anyway, you're reconnecting all the utilities anyway. The marginal cost of burying the wires is quite small. And so that's the way you get extra tree canopy, is through this extra density, through the development. It becomes relatively low cost to plant tall trees. And the two can coexist very easily. If you look at Tarman or King's Cross, we have many suburbs with medium to high density, and they've got trees that, you know, go up for 4 or 5 stories high. So
and the assumption, therefore, though, is that existing tree canopy doesn't have to also be ripped up and disappear in order to start again. Because I think it's the timeliness now and the fact that temperatures are warming and we're already in a zone where we can't afford to lose any tree canopy. And again, what I question is, where does that fit? How do you deal with that if you don't have good, strong land use planning controls?
The two can coexist. That can coexist with transport-oriented development easily. And if my council, Ku-ring-gai Council, was interested in a cooperative outcome, then they could have negotiated with the state government saying, yes, we'll have your extra density, but we want it as long as we can preserve the tree canopy.
Yes.
And you could have had a negotiated outcome that would have been mutually beneficial, that it would have achieved both the state and the local council objections. But instead we got this uncompromising opposition with worse outcomes.
Dr. Tulip, doesn't that come somewhat to the point in terms of a master planning process, though? Because you've got a TODSEP at the moment where you've got a minimum lot width of 21 metres. So you are not necessarily promoting, as you say, that active redevelopment of a whole street or a whole precinct or a consolidation where you can get these additional benefits out of the program. And what we might see occur in your suburb of Roseville is you've got, you know, one apartment block of 6 stories that pops up on one 21 metre block, and then you've got somewhere next door where it's not activated, so to speak, and you don't get that broader community benefit.
And I agree. I mean, and a negotiated outcome with the council and state government talking together would have been better. Yep.
I know we're running out of time. I still have one more question. I just wanted to put something to you that was put to us during a hearing, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. I'm sure you are. But Docklands, as in Melbourne, as a density development. I'm just curious about what your views are. Done well, done badly? How do you see that particular development? Somebody put a convincing argument to me that has stuck with me, and I'm really curious about whether you have views on Docklands in Melbourne.
I think the views on Docklands are a bit outdated. So could that development have been done better? Could it have succeeded more in its first 10, 15 years, 20 years of existence? Yes, but it's now a pretty vibrant community.
Right.
You know, what you see there from friends who live there is that it's a place where you can have access to comparatively cheaper housing, frankly, that is townhouses or particularly sort of apartments where people have got the city on their doorstep, and you see people who choose to live in that location for that reason. And if the alternative location for them was to live in Broadmeadows, I think they've clearly chosen the former because it's more suitable to their preferences than the alternative. So, I think what we need to be weighing up here, Chair, is we shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good when the risk is that you end up just with more of the status quo. I think that is the biggest risk.
I don't think anybody, to be frank, I don't think anybody is talking about the status quo. I think everybody...
Okay.
No. I mean, on the first day, you had the Friends of Ku-ring-gai Environment and the Haberfield residents that explicitly wanted maintenance of the status quo. So, and they are the decisive political force opposing what we're suggesting. That, so the politicians here will be able to speak to this better, but they're an extremely powerful political group. And they have large support within all three political parties of just defence of the status quo is in fact the main opposition to what we're saying. So I disagree with you.
Okay. No, sorry. And
I think you're right that no experts want defence of the status quo, but the public is on a different planet with
some
this.
members of the public.
So it was interesting that you mentioned...
And this is why I think your inquiry can do an awful lot of good by relating expert opinion that that the status quo is indefensible. That just does need to be explained.
Well, some politicians want to disallow the Todd SIP. How do you feel about that?
Right here.
Now. Mr. Morton, sorry, you were about to
I
finish.
was just amused at the Docklands reference.
Getting more evidence as to why.
And I must admit, I feel a bit guilty. I feel I need to qualify it a bit. It was something I'd never come across. That's why it was raising it.
Look, as chance happens, I was there on Wednesday night, literally, and surprised at how lively and busy that part of Melbourne was, and how, as our colleague said, it used to be a part of Melbourne that was difficult to get to. It wasn't properly, anchored to the rest of the city, and we managed to negotiate returning from that busy part of the city on a Wednesday night on a very chilly, grey, grey Melbourne bleak city evening. Sorry, Sydney bias. And then on foot back into town, and there were people of all ages in the town, which was something that would be fantastic to have with our Lord Mayor and our city of Sydney. Frankly, that kind of activation of the CBD. Obviously, they had their challenges in COVID. Obviously, it doesn't. Aesthetically, it isn't everybody's cup of tea, but they've improved it vastly.
Just on that, and just finally, Dr. Coates, I know you said it could have been done better. The Docklands thing. What were you referring to? Because as I say, I'm unfamiliar with it.
Okay, so a couple of things. Thank you for calling me doctor, but I'm not in fact.
Oh, sorry,
doctor.
I
That's
picked
okay.
that up.
No, I think I might have missed.
Yeah, I got that.
If a PhD was that easy to come by, I would have one by now. Just a couple of stats that are worth keeping in mind. The average age of people living in Docklands is 32, compared to the average age across Victoria of 38. So who is living in this location now? It's younger people who have almost half have got a tertiary qualification. So it's younger professionals who want to be close to the city, right? That's the benefit. That's who's using that facility. It's got a lot of young families, and I can say that because there are places in Docklands that I go with my children, that are fun, exciting places that have been set up down there that otherwise, wouldn't exist as close to the city. When I say what could have been done better, look, I think for a period there, it didn't. The area didn't have as much green space as it needed to have that went with that. And I think that's probably one of the things that you could have seen happen. It didn't have the transport link straight away that it now has. The tram wasn't going straight down there originally. And they are going to have challenges there and in Fisherman's Bend about how you get that large number of people into the city, which is going to require probably additional infrastructure. And finally, they put a whopping big stadium that's sitting between the edge of the Melbourne CBD and most of Docklands. And frankly, as a use of land, that probably didn't help the community develop because it had this sort of this dead space between where the community was and where the CBD was. It broke that connection in a way that probably wasn't helpful.
Right. Thanks for the indulgence. Now I know. We have come to time.
Go
We've
visit
run over
doctors.
time. Yeah, I'll go and visit.
Site visit.
Site visit. Thank you. Let's go to Auckland. No, thank you so much, all of you, for your time, your evidence. If there was anything taken on notice, the Secretariat would be in contact. And thank you. It's been very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.